You want your maiden name back? That's all? Daniel Moore's laughter echoed through the Seattle courthouse, his designer suit catching the fluorescent lights as he humiliated the woman he'd promised to love forever. Everyone watched Evelyn Moore, worn clothes, silent dignity, except nothing in the divorce. No money, no assets, just her name. Daniel signed with a flourish, already texting his mistress. He'd won, or so he thought, because outside that courthouse, a forbidden black car waited, and inside sat a man who could erase empires with a signature. Daniel had no idea his ex-wife had just played the most devastating long game in history. Don't miss what happens when the truth detonates. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. You won't believe what comes next. The King County Courthouse smelled like old wood and broken promises. Evelyn Moore sat in the third row of the gallery, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of stillness that comes from years of making yourself smaller. Her coat, a Navy thrift store find from 3 winters ago, had a loose button she'd been meaning to fix for months. Her shoes, practical flats with scuffed toes, were planted firmly on the worn marble floor. She didn't fidget, didn't check her phone, didn't cry. She simply waited. Across the aisle, Daniel Moore commanded the room like he'd been born to it. At 34, he looked like success had been tailored specifically for him. His charcoal Tom Ford suit fit perfectly across shoulders broadened by a personal trainer and a carefully curated Instagram presence. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the light every time he gestured, which was often. His dark hair was styled with the kind of calculated casualness that cost $300 a month to maintain. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, one arm draped casually over the back of his attorney's chair, his smile sharp and white and utterly without warmth. Your Honor, his lawyer, Martin Blackwell, stood with the bearing of someone who billed $800 an hour and enjoyed every minute of it. My client has been more than generous in these proceedings, more than generous. Daniel nodded, his expression arranging itself into something approximating concern. It wasn't convincing. He wasn't trying to be convincing. Not really. Judge Patricia Henley, a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human foolishness, looked unimpressed. Mr. Blackwell, I'm aware of your client's offer. I'm waiting to hear Mrs. Moore's response. All eyes turned to Evelyn. She could feel the weight of their attention like physical pressure. The court reporter, fingers poised over her stenograph. The handful of spectators who'd wandered in for the free drama. The young law clerk taking notes in the corner, Daniel's mistress, though of course no one called her that officially, sitting 2 rows behind him in a dress that cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. Her name was Amber. She was 26. She worked in Daniel's company's marketing department, though Evelyn suspected her primary qualification had been her appearance in a bodycon dress at last year's holiday party. Amber wasn't even trying to hide her presence. She examined her manicure, a fresh set of acrylics in millennial pink, with the bored expression of someone waiting for a pleasant but predictable conclusion. Evelyn's lawyer, Margaret Chen, touched her arm gently. Margaret was in her 50s, with kind eyes, and a practice that primarily handled family law for clients who couldn't afford the Blackwells of the world. She'd taken Evelyn's case for a fraction of her usual fee, and Evelyn knew it. You don't have to accept his offer, Margaret whispered. We can push back. You're entitled to— I know what I'm entitled to, Evelyn said softly. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Margaret pause. It's okay. Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but she'd learned over the past 3 months that when Evelyn Moore made a decision, there was no moving her. Mrs. Moore, Judge Henley prompted. I need your response for the record. Evelyn stood. She was 5'6" in her practical flats, slender in a way that had less to do with genetics and more to do with the kind of stress that made food seem optional. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup except a touch of concealer under eyes that hadn't seen a full night's sleep in months. She wore a simple black dress that had been appropriate for job interviews 5 years ago and was now just appropriate for trying to maintain dignity in impossible situations. She looked, in every measurable way, like exactly what Daniel had spent the last hour painting her as. A woman who'd contributed nothing, gained everything, and deserved less than she was being offered. Your Honor. Evelyn's voice was steady, clear, and so quiet the court reporter had to lean forward slightly. I don't want Mr. Moore's settlement. The courtroom went still. Daniel's smile flickered. Just for a second. Then it widened, and he leaned over to whisper something to Martin that made the lawyer smirk. Mrs. Moore, Judge Henley said carefully, I want to make sure you understand what you're declining. Mr. Moore has offered you $250,000 in a lump sum payment, plus 18 months of continued health insurance coverage. Given that you have no independent income at present, I understand, Your Honor. Evelyn's hands were steady at her sides. I don't want his money. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. Even Amber looked up from her nails, a small frown creasing her carefully Botoxed forehead. Daniel laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. Not exactly. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they encounter something so absurd, so beneath them, that cruelty would almost be giving it too much credit. It was dismissive, pitying. The laugh of a man watching a child insist they don't need help reaching the top shelf. Of course you don't, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, because that would require you to have some dignity to maintain. Mr. Moore, Judge Henley's voice carried a warning. Daniel held up his hands in mock surrender, that perfect smile never wavering. My apologies, Your Honor. I'm trying to understand my wife's thinking here. My ex-wife's thinking. He said it like the words tasted good. She lived in my house for 6 years, drove my car, ate food I paid for, wore clothes I bought her. Though looking at her now, apparently she didn't wear them very often. Someone in the gallery snickered. Evelyn didn't turn to see who. She contributed nothing to the household, Daniel continued, warming to his theme now, playing to the room like he was pitching investors instead of dissolving a marriage. No income, no job. She couldn't even be bothered to maintain the house properly or, he paused, a calculated beat, fulfill her obligations as a wife. The implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Margaret shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. I agree. Judge Henley's voice could have frozen water. Mr. Moore, I'll remind you that this is a courtroom, not a therapy session. You'll keep your commentary professional or I'll hold you in contempt. Am I clear? Crystal, Your Honor. Daniel didn't look remotely chastened. If anything, he looked energized. This was a performance, and he was enjoying it. I'm just trying to make sense of why someone who took 6 years of my life and gave nothing in return would turn down $250,000 in free money. That's all. He looked directly at Evelyn then, and she saw it in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he'd already won, that she was beaten, that this was just the final formality before he stepped into the life he actually deserved, with the girl he actually wanted, freed from the dead weight of a wife who'd somehow tricked him into marriage in the first place. Unless, Daniel said slowly, she thinks she can get more. Is that it, Evie? He used the nickname deliberately, the one he'd whispered in the early days when they'd still been happy. Now it was a weapon. You think if you hold out, play the victim, I'll cave and give you more. Because let me save you the suspense. I won't. Evelyn met his eyes. For the first time in months, maybe years, she really looked at the man she'd married. She'd been 23 when they met, fresh out of MIT with a master's in computer science and a head full of ideas she didn't quite know what to do with. He'd been 26, charming and ambitious, working 60-hour weeks at a startup that was going nowhere but talking like he could see the future. She'd fallen for his certainty, his vision, the way he made her feel like her ideas mattered, like together they could build something that would change everything. For the first 2 years, it had been good. They'd worked side by side in a cramped apartment in Capitol Hill, building the foundation of what would become more technologies. She'd written code until her eyes burned. He'd pitched investors until his voice went hoarse. They'd been a team. Then the money came, and slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, Daniel had started editing her out of the story. The investors wanted to hear from him, not her. The press wanted to interview the charismatic founder, not his quiet wife. Her name disappeared from the company documents, from the patents, from the history they were supposedly writing together. She told herself it was strategy, that it didn't matter who got credit as long as they succeeded together. She'd been so stupid. I don't want more, Evelyn said quietly. I want less. Daniel blinked. What? I don't want your money. I don't want the house, or the car, or the health insurance, or anything you're offering. She turned to Judge Henley. Your Honor, I'm willing to sign the divorce decree today with no financial settlement. The only thing I'm asking for is my maiden name back. The silence that followed was absolute. Your maiden name, Judge Henley repeated slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to be Evelyn Vale again. Daniel's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Daniel waved him off, his expression caught between confusion and something that might have been concern. For just a second, he looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. Then the moment passed, and the smirk returned. Vale, he said, testing the word. That's right. I'd almost forgotten you had a family before you attached yourself to mine. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, the picture of casual cruelty. Sure. Take it back. Take the name and go back to whatever life you had before you decided to coast on mine for 6 years. See how far it gets you. Daniel, Martin murmured, a note of warning in his voice. What? She doesn't want the money. Fine. Great. Makes this easier for everyone. Daniel pulled out his phone, already bored with the conversation. Let's sign the papers and be done with this. I have actual important things to do today. Judge Henley looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and something passed between them, a recognition, woman to woman, of wounds that didn't show on any legal document. Mrs. Moore, or Ms. Vale, if you prefer, I'm going to ask you one more time, on the record. You're declining all financial settlement, all asset division, and all support. You understand that once these papers are signed, you cannot come back and request reconsideration. Is this really what you want? Yes, Your Honor, Evelyn said. It is. All right then, Judge Henley gestured to the clerk. Bring me the modified decree. The next 15 minutes were pure procedural efficiency. Papers were signed, witnessed, stamped with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ended marriages every day in courtrooms just like this one. Daniel signed his name with a flourish, handed the pen back without looking at Evelyn, and immediately turned to text someone on his phone. Probably Amber, probably something crude and celebratory. Margaret gathered her files with a quiet sadness that made Evelyn want to apologize for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. It's done, Judge Henley said finally. The marriage between Daniel Moore and Evelyn Moore is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. Ms. Vale, your legal name change is approved. You're both free to go. Daniel was on his feet before the judge finished speaking. Finally, he muttered, loud enough for Evelyn to hear. 6 years too late, but finally. He strode toward the exit without a backward glance, Martin hurrying after him with a briefcase full of documents that had just made Daniel's life infinitely easier. Amber tottered after them on heels too high for courthouse floors, her hand already reaching for Daniel's arm in a gesture of possession that would have hurt Evelyn 6 months ago. Now she felt nothing. Well, not nothing, but not pain. Not anymore. She felt clear. Evelyn, Margaret said softly, touching her elbow, are you sure you're okay? You can stay at my place tonight if you need somewhere to... I'm fine, Margaret. Really? Evelyn managed a small smile. Thank you for everything. You have my number. If you need anything, I'll call, I promise. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Margaret was kind enough not to push. Evelyn gathered her coat, the one with the loose button, and her purse, a worn leather thing she'd bought at a thrift store after Daniel had accidentally thrown out her old one during a cleaning spree. She walked toward the exit with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire proceeding, her footsteps nearly silent on the marble floor. Behind her, she heard whispers. Nothing, can you believe? Must be desperate. He's well rid of her. She pushed through the heavy courtroom doors and stepped into the hallway beyond. The King County Courthouse was a maze of marble and government efficiency, all echoing halls and busy people moving from one crisis to another. Lawyers in expensive suits arguing on cell phones, defendants looking shell-shocked outside criminal courtrooms, families clustered on benches waiting for their turn at justice or something approximating it. Evelyn moved through it all like a ghost, unnoticed and unnoticing. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, old habit, from the years when Daniel had been obsessed with her weight, with her appearance, with making sure she looked like the kind of wife a successful tech founder should have. The stairs were empty and echoing, and she let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. By the time she reached the ground floor, her heart was steady again. The main lobby was crowded with the usual mix of people whose lives had intersected with the legal system in ways both tragic and mundane. She wove through them toward the exit, toward the Seattle afternoon that waited beyond the security checkpoints and metal detectors. The sky outside was the particular gray that Seattle specialized in. Not quite raining, not quite not raining, just a constant damp promise of water that might or might not materialize. The temperature hovered somewhere in the low 50s, cool enough to justify the coat Evelyn pulled tighter around herself. The courthouse steps spread before her, wide and stone, and designed to make people feel appropriately small in the face of justice. At the bottom of those steps, in the circular drive marked clearly with no parking, official vehicles only signs sat a car. Not just any car. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, black as midnight, with chrome details that caught what little light the Seattle sky provided. The kind of car that cost more than most people's houses. The kind of car that made people stop walking and stare because they'd never seen one outside of movies or celebrity Instagram posts. The kind of car that absolutely, categorically, should not have been parked in a spot reserved for court security vehicles. And yet there it was. Evelyn looked at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she started down the steps. Behind her, the courthouse doors burst open with the kind of dramatic force that suggested someone was very pleased with themselves. Absolutely. Yes, the Bellevue property. I want it on the market by Friday. Daniel Moore's voice carried across the courthouse steps, loud and confident and utterly unconcerned with who might overhear. He had his phone pressed to his ear with one hand, his other arm around Amber's waist in a gesture that was probably supposed to look affectionate but mostly looked possessive. No, fire the current listing agent. I want someone who understands luxury properties. Yes, exactly. He stopped mid-sentence because he'd seen the car. More specifically, he'd seen Evelyn walking toward it. For a second, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Evelyn, his pathetic, useless ex-wife who'd just walked away from $250,000 because she was too proud or too stupid to take free money, was approaching a Rolls-Royce like she had some business with it. Evie? The word came out before he could stop it, sharp with confusion. She didn't turn around. Evie! Louder now, with an edge of something that might have been concern or might have been annoyance at not being acknowledged. What are you doing? Amber tugged at his arm. Daniel, come on, we have reservations. Wait. He shook her off, his attention fixed on the scene unfolding below. Evelyn had reached the bottom of the steps. She was walking across the circular drive with that same quiet purpose she'd shown in the courtroom, heading straight for the Rolls-Royce like she had every right to be there. This was wrong. This didn't make sense. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she was going to make a scene, throw herself at whoever owned that car and beg for money. That had to be it. She was desperate, and she'd seen an opportunity, and she was going to humiliate herself in some last-ditch attempt to... The driver's door of the Rolls-Royce opened. A man stepped out. He was massive, 6'4" easily, built like someone who'd spent time in military service or private security or both. His suit was dark and perfectly tailored to accommodate the kind of muscle mass that suggested he could break a person in half if circumstances required it. His head was shaved, his expression was professionally neutral, and when he moved around the front of the car, it was with the kind of controlled efficiency that made Daniel think of Secret Service agents or bodyguards for visiting dignitaries. The man reached the passenger door and opened it and stood at attention, waiting. Daniel had started down the steps without consciously deciding to move. Behind him, Martin was saying something about client confidentiality and being careful, but Daniel wasn't listening. He was watching Evelyn approach that car like she belonged there, and his brain was trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Evelyn! He called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of command he used in board meetings when someone was making a presentation he didn't approve of. What the hell are you doing? She stopped. For just a moment, she paused with her hand on the door frame of the Rolls-Royce. Then she looked back at him. Her expression was perfectly calm, not smug, not triumphant, not even particularly interested, just calm. "Leaving, Daniel," she said quietly, "just like you wanted." "In that?" He gestured at the car, trying to make it sound ridiculous, trying to make her see how absurd this looked. "Did you hire that to make some kind of point? Because I hate to break it to you, but renting a luxury car for the day doesn't make you—" The rear passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. The world went very, very quiet. Daniel's words died in his throat because he recognized the man emerging from the back of that Rolls-Royce. Everyone in Seattle's tech scene would have recognized him. Hell, everyone in American business would have recognized him because his face had been on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, Bloomberg Businessweek, and half a dozen other publications over the last decade. Marcus Vale. 62 years old and aging like some men did, sharp instead of soft, distinguished instead of diminished. Silver hair cut with military precision. A suit that probably cost more than the car, though with someone at his level, it was hard to say which. Tall, lean, with the kind of presence that made boardrooms go silent and competitors go pale. Marcus Vale, who'd built an empire from nothing. Marcus Vale, who was legendary for his absolutely ruthless approach to business. Marcus Vale, who'd dismantled 3 Fortune 500 companies in hostile takeovers so efficient they'd become case studies at Harvard Business School. Marcus Vale, who could buy and sell Daniel's entire company with what he probably spent on lunch. Marcus Vale was standing beside the Rolls-Royce, his attention entirely focused on Evelyn, with an expression that Daniel had never seen directed at his ex-wife before. Warmth. "Ms. Vale," Marcus said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without him having to raise it. "I apologize for the wait. Traffic from the airport was worse than I expected." Ms. Vale. The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Vale. The same last name Evelyn had just legally reclaimed. The same last name as the man standing in front of them. No, that was coincidence. That was— "It's fine, Marcus," Evelyn said, and her voice was different now. Not the quiet, defeated tone she'd used in the courtroom. Stronger, clear, like she'd shed something heavy and was remembering how to stand up straight. "Thank you for coming." Marcus extended his hand and Evelyn took it. Not a handshake. He handed her into the car like she was something precious, his grip steady and supportive. The gesture of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Daniel found his voice. Wait, what is— Marcus's eyes shifted to him then, and Daniel felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Moore," Marcus said. His tone was pleasant, conversational, and somehow more threatening than any amount of shouting could have been. "Congratulations on your divorce. I understand it went quite smoothly." Yes, but—" Daniel looked at Evelyn, who was settling into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce like she'd been riding in cars like this her entire life. "Evelyn, what is happening?" She looked at him through the open door, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Pity. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said quietly. "No, wait. You can't just—" He started forward, but the bodyguard shifted position slightly. Nothing threatening, but absolutely a wall, and Daniel stopped. Marcus was already moving back toward the car. "Mr. Moore, I'd strongly suggest you speak with your lawyer. Soon. You'll be receiving some documentation that requires your attention." "Documentation? What documentation? What the hell is going on?" But Marcus had already settled into the back seat beside Evelyn. The bodyguard closed the door with the solid, expensive sound of German engineering and moved back to the driver's seat. The engine started. Quiet, powerful, the kind of purr that cost 6 figures to achieve. Daniel stood frozen on the courthouse steps as the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb with perfect, unhurried elegance. Inside, through windows tinted just enough to suggest privacy while still being legal, he could see Evelyn's silhouette. She didn't look back. The car merged into Seattle traffic and disappeared. Daniel stood there, phone forgotten in his hand, Amber forgotten beside him, Martin saying something urgent about needing to make calls, needing to find out what was happening. But Daniel wasn't listening. Because his brain had finally connected the dots his arrogance had been preventing him from seeing. Vale. Marcus Vale. Evelyn Vale. The woman he'd just divorced, The woman he'd humiliated in open court, the woman he'd dismissed as useless and worthless and pathetic, had just left with one of the most powerful men in American business. A man who shared her last name. A man who'd looked at her with warmth and respect and something that suggested history, suggested connection, suggested that Daniel had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Daniel," Martin's voice was sharp now, urgent. "I just got a call from your primary investor. They're requesting an emergency meeting tonight. They're saying, Daniel, they're talking about pulling funding." Daniel turned to stare at his lawyer, but he wasn't really seeing him. He was seeing Evelyn's face as she'd signed those divorce papers. Calm, clear, not beaten, not broken. Waiting. "Oh God," Daniel whispered. Behind him, Amber was asking what was wrong, why everyone looked so worried. Could they please just go to lunch because these heels were killing her? But Daniel barely heard her, because for the first time in 6 years, he was realizing that he might not have known his wife at all. And if he'd been wrong about that, if he'd been wrong about Evelyn, then what else had he been wrong about? The courthouse steps suddenly felt very cold. And somewhere in Seattle traffic, in the back of a Rolls-Royce that cost more than Daniel's first house, Evelyn Vale was finally breathing easy. The Rolls-Royce glided through Seattle traffic with the kind of silence that only excessive wealth could buy. Outside, the city moved past in its usual gray blur, coffee shops and tech startups, construction cranes and Amazon towers, the relentless march of progress that had transformed Seattle from a sleepy port city into a global hub of innovation and obscene amounts of money. Inside the car, Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar streets slide by like scenes from someone else's life. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly, not looking at the man beside her. "I could have handled it myself." Marcus Vale studied his daughter with the kind of attention most people reserved for quarterly earnings reports or hostile takeover opportunities. His expression was difficult to read. It always had been, even when she was a child. But there was something in his eyes that suggested genuine concern, which for Marcus Vale was about as emotional as he ever got in public. "I know you could have," he said. His voice had the particular quality of people who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives, measured, confident, and absolutely certain of being heard. "That wasn't the point." "Then what was the point?" "The point," Marcus said, reaching into the built-in bar and pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal tumbler without asking if she wanted any, was making sure Daniel Moore understood exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. He handed her the glass. She took it but didn't drink, just held it between her palms like she was trying to warm her hands. "Did you see his face?" Marcus continued, allowing himself the smallest smile. "When I stepped out of the car?" "I saw it." "Good. That's a memory worth keeping." Through the partition separating them from the driver, Evelyn could see the back of James's head. James had been with Marcus for 15 years, ever since a particularly ugly business deal had resulted in death threats that Marcus had taken seriously enough to hire professional protection. He was former Delta Force, spoke 4 languages, and had once broken a man's arm in 3 places for getting too close to Marcus at a shareholder meeting. He was also, Evelyn had learned over the years, surprisingly good at baking sourdough bread, and had strong opinions about classical music. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "As long as it takes." Marcus. "Dad," he corrected gently. "When we're alone, Evelyn, you can call me Dad. You've earned that much." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something crack in her chest. She'd held it together through the entire court proceeding, held it together through Daniel's cruelty and the judge's pity and the whispers from strangers who'd decided her entire worth based on a 20-minute hearing. She'd held it together because she'd had to, because showing weakness to Daniel would have been giving him something he didn't deserve. But here, in the leather-scented quiet of her father's car, with the man who'd built empires and destroyed competitors, and still somehow found time to fly across the country because his daughter needed him. "I'm okay," she managed, and her voice only shook a little. "I know you are." Marcus sipped his own whiskey, studying her with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're a Vale. We don't break. We wait. And then we win." The car turned onto Madison Street, heading east toward the waterfront. Through the tinted windows, Evelyn could see people going about their Friday afternoons, running errands, meeting friends for happy hour, living lives that didn't include divorce courts, or public humiliation, or fathers who could buy and sell entire companies before breakfast. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The Four Seasons. I have a suite. You need rest, a proper meal, and probably about 12 hours of sleep that doesn't happen in that apartment you've been hiding in." "I wasn't hiding, Evelyn," she sighed. "Okay, I was hiding a little." "A little," Marcus repeated dryly. "You've been living in a 400-square-foot studio in Fremont for the last 6 months, working as a barista under a fake name, and you call that hiding a little. I needed space to think." "You needed space to plan," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference. And now that the planning phase is over, we move to execution." Evelyn finally took a sip of the whiskey. It was Pappy Van Winkle, 23-year-old, probably worth more per ounce than most people spent on groceries in a week. It tasted like smoke and oak, and the kind of money that didn't have to prove anything to anyone. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly. Marcus set his glass down in the car's built-in holder with a soft clink. "Am I sure about destroying the man who stole 6 years of your life, took credit for your work, isolated you from your family, and then humiliated you in open court? Yes, Evelyn, I'm remarkably sure about that. He didn't know who I was, who you are. That's not an excuse, that's an indictment." Marcus's voice hardened in a way that had made Fortune 500 CEOs sweat during negotiations. "He married you, Evelyn. He promised to love and protect you, and instead he treated you like something disposable. The fact that he was too arrogant to do even basic research on your background doesn't make it better. It makes it worse." The car slowed as traffic thickened near Pike Place Market. Even on a gray Friday afternoon, tourists and locals crowded the sidewalks, drawn by the promise of fresh fish and artisan donuts, and the particular charm of a market that had somehow survived gentrification by becoming an icon too valuable to destroy. "What about the company?" Evelyn asked. "More technologies. The employees? Most of them are good people. They don't deserve to lose their jobs because Daniel is—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Daniel." Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who'd spent 40 years playing chess while his opponents were still learning checkers. "Oh, the company will be fine," he said. "Better than fine, actually. Once we remove the incompetent CEO and install actual leadership. The employees will keep their jobs, probably get better benefits, if I'm honest. More Technologies has good bones. You built most of them yourself. It just needs management that isn't actively trying to run it into the ground through sheer arrogance." "You're taking it over." "I already own it," Marcus said simply. "Daniel just doesn't know it yet." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "Do you remember Thornhill Capital Management, the venture capital firm that led More Technologies' Series B funding 3 years ago?" "Of course, they put in $15 million. Daniel wouldn't shut up about it for months." Thornhill Capital is a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings, which is owned by a private equity group called Slate and Associates, which is owned by you, Evelyn finished, understanding dawning across her face. "Owned by me," Marcus confirmed. "Daniel Moore has been spending my money, using my infrastructure, and building his little tech kingdom on foundations I control. He just never bothered to look past the first layer of corporate ownership to see who was really signing the checks." The car pulled up to the Four Seasons, and Evelyn could see the doorman already moving into position, recognizing the vehicle and preparing to provide the kind of service that Marcus Vale's presence demanded. But she couldn't move yet. She was processing the implications. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you owned his company?" 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Marcus said. "Since about 3 months after you called me from that coffee shop bathroom, crying so hard I could barely understand what you were saying." Evelyn closed her eyes, remembering that day. The worst day. The day she'd finally admitted to herself that her marriage wasn't just struggling, it was destroying her. Daniel had thrown a glass at the wall during an argument about her laziness, and she'd locked herself in the bathroom while he raged outside. She'd called her father from the floor of that bathroom, something she'd sworn she wouldn't do, and told him everything. The isolation, the verbal abuse, the way Daniel had systematically erased her from the company she'd helped build, the gaslighting, the cruelty. The mistress he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. All of it. Marcus had listened in silence. Then he'd said 3 words. "I'll handle it." She'd thought he meant lawyers, a good divorce attorney, maybe some financial support. She'd underestimated her father spectacularly. "You've been planning this for 2 years?" she whispered. "Closer to 3 if you count the preliminary research phase." Marcus opened his door as James came around to assist. "Revenge is like any other business venture, Evelyn. It requires capital, planning, and patience. I had all 3. They stepped out of the car into the covered entrance of the Four Seasons, where the doorman greeted Marcus by name and somehow managed to completely ignore the fact that Evelyn looked like she'd dressed for a different kind of establishment entirely. That was the thing about truly expensive hotels. They'd learned that actual wealth didn't always announce itself with logos and labels. The lobby was exactly what Evelyn expected. All marble and subtle lighting and the kind of quiet elegance that cost a fortune to maintain. A few heads turned as Marcus entered, recognition flickering across faces that knew money when they saw it. The hotel manager himself appeared within 30 seconds, smiling with the kind of professional warmth that suggested Marcus was a very, very regular customer. "Mr. Vale, welcome back. Your suite is ready, of course. And the private dining room you requested for this evening? Actually, Jonathan, we'll take dinner in the suite tonight. Ms. Vale has had a difficult day." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. "Of course, sir. I'll have the executive chef send up a selection. Shall we say 7 o'clock? "Perfect." They crossed the lobby to a private elevator that required a key card to access. James had somehow already procured this and handed it to Marcus without being asked. The doors closed on the 3 of them, and Evelyn watched the floor numbers climb with a kind of detached fascination. 24th floor, 25th, 26th. "I could have stopped it," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her. "What?" "The divorce. This whole thing. I could have told Daniel who you were, who I was. Things would have been different." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "He would have treated you differently. Because he was afraid of me. Because he wanted access to my money and my connections. Not because he loved you, not because he valued you. Is that really the marriage you wanted to save?" The elevator doors opened onto a private hallway with exactly 2 doors. Marcus's suite took up half the floor. "No," Evelyn admitted. "I guess not." Inside the suite was everything the lobby had promised, and more. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Furniture that probably cost more than most cars. Art on the walls that looked original because it was. A grand piano in the corner because apparently someone had decided that multi-million-dollar suites weren't complete without one. James did a quick sweep of the rooms, old habits from his security days, then positioned himself near the door with the kind of professional invisibility that came from years of practice. Marcus guided Evelyn to a cream-colored sofa that faced the windows and the gray expanse of Puget Sound beyond. The clouds had started to break up, and late afternoon sun was trying to push through, turning the water silver and gold. "Tell me about him," Marcus said, sitting beside her. "Not the Daniel you married, the Daniel you saw in that courtroom today." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, watching a ferry make its slow way across the Sound toward Bainbridge Island. "He was happy," she said finally. "Not just satisfied or relieved. Actually happy. Like getting rid of me was the best thing that had happened to him in years." It probably was, from his perspective. He got everything he wanted. His mistress, his company, his freedom. And all it cost him was $250,000 he would have spent on a car without thinking twice. He called me dead weight. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm aware. I had someone recording the proceedings." "Of course he did." "The thing is," Evelyn continued, "he wasn't entirely wrong. I did become dead weight. Not at first, but over time. I let it happen. I let him convince me that my ideas didn't matter, that my contributions were less important, that I should be grateful he even kept me around. I became the woman he described in that courtroom." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You became a woman trapped in an abusive marriage who was doing what she needed to do to survive. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. He turned to face her fully, and his expression was more serious than she'd seen it in years. Evelyn, I have done business with some of the worst people in America. Men who destroy companies for profit. Women who sell out their employees for stock options. People who would quite literally step over bodies to get what they want. And you know what they all have in common? What? They think everyone else is as corrupt as they are. Daniel Moore looked at you, brilliant, talented, genuinely good you, and assumed you were lazy because he couldn't imagine someone contributing without demanding credit. He assumed you had nothing to offer because he's never offered anything that wasn't calculated for maximum personal benefit. His cruelty says everything about him and nothing about you. Evelyn felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She'd cried enough over Daniel Moore. She was done giving him that power. What happens now? She asked. Marcus leaned back, his expression shifting into something that any of his business competitors would have recognized immediately as dangerous. Now? He said. Now we watch him realize what he's lost. And I don't mean you, though he'll eventually understand that losing you was losing the only thing of real value in his life. I mean everything else, his company, his money, his reputation, his future. How? The beauty of the situation, Marcus said, is that I don't actually have to do very much. Daniel has been running more technologies into the ground for the last 18 months, making increasingly poor decisions and covering them up with accounting tricks and investor presentations. I've been letting him, watching him, documenting everything. You've been waiting for today. I've been waiting for you to be free, Marcus corrected. For you to walk out of that courthouse with nothing tying you to him legally. No financial settlement he could claw back. No shared assets he could freeze. Nothing, just a clean break and a return to your real name. Through the windows, the sun was finally winning its battle with the clouds, and the city was starting to glow with that particular golden light that made Seattle beautiful despite its reputation for rain. When does it start? Evelyn asked. Marcus checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that was probably worth more than Daniel's car. Daniel's primary investor meeting is in, he consulted the time, approximately 45 minutes. They're going to inform him that Thornhill Capital is calling in its debt early, all of it, due in 30 days. Evelyn's eyes widened. He doesn't have that kind of liquidity. No, Marcus agreed. He doesn't. He's been spending money like he has unlimited access to funding because, until today, he thought he did. His burn rate is catastrophic. His actual revenue is about 30% of what he's been claiming to investors. His last 3 product launches have been disasters that he's covered up with creative accounting. How do you know all this? Because I own the company, which means I own the books. The real books. Not the version Daniel shows at board meetings. Marcus stood and walked to the windows, hands in his pockets, looking every inch the billionaire who'd built his empire through a combination of brilliant strategy and absolutely ruthless execution. He's going to try to raise emergency funding, Marcus continued. But he'll find that every major VC firm in Seattle has suddenly lost interest. His credit lines will evaporate. His personal assets, the ones he was so proud of keeping in his name only, will be frozen pending investigation into financial irregularities. Investigation? The SEC takes fraud very seriously, Marcus said mildly, especially when someone's been misrepresenting revenue to investors. I'm sure it's just an unfortunate misunderstanding, but these things do take time to sort out. 6 months, maybe a year. Long enough for everything Daniel built to completely collapse. Evelyn stood, moving to join her father at the window. Together they looked out over the city, this place where she'd been happy once, before everything went wrong. This is going to destroy him, she said quietly. Yes. Completely. Yes. And you're okay with that? Marcus turned to look at her, and his expression was colder than she'd ever seen it. He humiliated my daughter in open court. He stole her work and claimed it as his own. He isolated her from her family for 6 years because he was too insecure to allow her to have anything that didn't belong to him. He made her believe she was worthless. Marcus's voice was perfectly calm, but there was steel underneath it. So yes, Evelyn, I'm remarkably okay with destroying him. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. Before Evelyn could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something like satisfaction crossed his face. That was fast, he murmured. What? Daniel just left his emergency investor meeting. Apparently it did not go well. Marcus showed her the message from someone named Caroline, who Evelyn assumed was part of her father's extensive network of people who kept him informed about everything that mattered. The message was brief. He's panicking. Looked like he might vomit in the parking garage. Called his lawyer 6 times in the elevator. That's just the beginning, Marcus said. By Monday, every tech journalist in Seattle will have received anonymous tips about more technology's financial irregularities. By Wednesday, the SEC will officially open an investigation. By Friday, his board will vote to remove him as CEO. And then? And then he'll have nothing, Marcus said simply. No company, no money, no reputation. He'll be exactly what he accused you of being, dead weight that nobody wants. Evelyn should have felt triumph, or satisfaction, or some kind of vindication. Instead, she just felt tired. I need to lie down, she said. Marcus's expression softened immediately. Of course, the bedroom is through there. I'll wake you for dinner. She started toward the bedroom, then paused. Marcus. Yes? Thank you. For coming. For all of this. Her father crossed the room and pulled her into a hug, the kind of embrace he'd given her when she was small and the world felt too big and scary. She let herself lean into it for just a moment, let herself be someone's daughter instead of someone's ex-wife. You're my only child, Marcus said quietly. Hurting you was the biggest mistake Daniel Moore ever made, and I'm going to make sure he understands that completely. 20 minutes later, Evelyn was lying in a bed that probably cost more than her studio apartment's annual rent, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. She was divorced, she was free, and her ex-husband's entire life was about to implode. She should sleep. She was exhausted in a way that went bone deep. But her mind kept replaying the scene on the courthouse steps. Daniel's face when he saw Marcus, the confusion, the dawning horror, the moment he'd realized that maybe, possibly, he'd miscalculated. Her phone buzzed. She'd been ignoring it all day, but curiosity got the better of her. She pulled it out and saw 17 missed calls, all from Daniel, and 3 text messages. The first, "We need to talk. Call me." The second, 15 minutes later, "Evelyn, this isn't funny. What the hell is going on? Who is that man?" The third, just 5 minutes ago, "I know you're seeing these. Call me, now." She stared at the messages for a long moment. Then she blocked his number. The phone immediately buzzed again. A different number. She didn't recognize it, but she could guess. "This is Martin Blackwell. I need to speak with you urgently regarding your divorce settlement. There may have been some errors in the paperwork that need to be corrected. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Evelyn showed the message to Marcus, who'd appeared in the doorway to check on her. He read it and laughed. Actually laughed. "Errors in the paperwork," he repeated. "That's adorable. They're already trying to find a way to reverse the settlement." "Can they?" "No. Judge Henley signed the decree. It's done. Daniel agreed to your terms, your complete lack of terms, actually, in open court. The only way to undo it would be to prove fraud or coercion, and good luck arguing that you coerced him into giving you nothing." Evelyn blocked that number too. "Get some rest," Marcus said. "The real show hasn't even started yet." She tried. She really did. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about the last 6 years. How she'd met Daniel when she was young and brilliant, and so sure that love and ambition could coexist perfectly. How they'd built something together, or she'd thought they had. How slowly, almost imperceptibly, she'd been edited out of the story until she was just the wife. Just the woman who lived in the house and wore the clothes and smiled at the parties and contributed nothing. Except she had contributed. Everything, actually. The core algorithm that made more technologies valuable? She'd written it. The user interface that made their flagship product accessible? Her design. The security protocols that protected their data? Her architecture. But Daniel had presented it all, had taken credit for it all, had smiled for the cameras and accepted the accolades, and never once mentioned that his silent wife was the reason his company existed. She'd let him. That was the part that hurt the most. She'd let him take her work and her ideas and her future because he'd convinced her it was strategic, that it was temporary, that they were a team. She'd been so stupid. But that was over now. Outside, the sun was setting over Elliott Bay, turning the water copper and gold. The ferries moved across the Sound like toys in a bathtub. The city lights were starting to come on, and Seattle was transforming from its daytime gray into its nighttime glow. Somewhere in that city, Daniel Moore was starting to realize that his perfect victory wasn't quite as perfect as he'd thought. And tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin. Evelyn finally felt herself drifting toward sleep, exhaustion winning out over anxiety. Her last conscious thought was wondering if Daniel had figured it out yet, if he'd connected the dots. If he understood that the quiet woman he'd humiliated in court, the wife he'd dismissed as worthless, was the daughter of a man who could destroy him with a phone call. If he'd realized that walking away from her wasn't his victory, it was his ending. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices in the suite's main room. For a disoriented moment, Evelyn couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the sheets too expensive, the light filtering through the curtains too gentle. Then memory flooded back. The courthouse, the divorce, Marcus stepping out of that Rolls-Royce like an avenging angel in a $3,000 suit. She checked her phone. 8:30 a.m., Saturday morning. She'd slept for nearly 15 hours, and she had 43 missed calls. Evelyn sat up slowly, her body protesting the movement after months of stress and poor sleep finally catching up with her. Through the bedroom door, left slightly ajar, she could hear Marcus speaking to someone in that particular tone he used when discussing business. Not angry, not raised, just absolutely certain of being obeyed. She showered in a bathroom that had heated floors and a rainfall showerhead and more marble than seemed strictly necessary, then dressed in the clothes that had somehow appeared in the closet overnight. Her size exactly. Simple but elegant. Tailored black pants, a silk blouse in deep emerald, a cashmere cardigan that probably cost more than her monthly rent at the Fremont studio. Marcus's doing, obviously. He'd always had an unsettling ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced. When she emerged into the main room, she found her father at the dining table with James and a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 40, dressed in a sharp burgundy suit, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was very good at whatever she did. Evelyn, Marcus stood immediately, genuine warmth crossing his usually controlled features. Good. You're awake. Coffee? Please. James was already pouring, because apparently elite bodyguards were also trained in hospitality. He handed her a cup, black, 1 sugar, exactly how she'd been drinking it since college, and returned to his position near the windows where he could monitor both the door and the street below. This is Caroline Frost, Marcus said, gesturing to the woman. She's been coordinating our efforts regarding the Moore situation. Caroline stood and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, and her smile was the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ms. Vale, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your father speaks very highly of you. Does he? Evelyn glanced at Marcus, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Occasionally, he admitted, when relevant to business operations. I'm sure that's very touching, Evelyn said dryly, accepting the chair James pulled out for her. The table was already set with breakfast. Pastries from the hotel bakery, fresh fruit, what looked like smoked salmon and cream cheese. She picked up a croissant more out of habit than hunger. Caroline has been monitoring Daniel's activities since yesterday afternoon, Marcus said, settling back into his chair with his own coffee. Perhaps you'd like to share the highlights? Caroline opened a leather portfolio that was probably worth more than most people's laptops. Inside were printed reports, photographs, and what looked like financial documents. She handled them with the casual efficiency of someone who dealt with sensitive information daily. Mr. Moore left his investor meeting at 4:15 p.m. yesterday, Caroline began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone delivering a weather report rather than someone's life falling apart. He made 7 phone calls in the first 10 minutes, all to potential funding sources. None of them returned his calls. By 6 p.m., he'd tried 14 different contacts. Still no responses. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed Daniel standing in what looked like a parking garage, phone pressed to his ear, his face twisted with an expression somewhere between panic and rage. He went home around 7, Caroline continued. The Bellevue penthouse, his companion, Amber, Evelyn supplied quietly. Yes. Ms. Amber Chen was waiting for him. They had what appeared to be a significant argument on the balcony, loud enough that building security received noise complaints from 3 separate units. Another photograph. This one showed Daniel and Amber on an expensive-looking balcony, both of them clearly shouting. Amber's perfectly manicured hands were thrown up in frustration. Daniel looked like he was about to put his fist through something. Ms. Chen left the residence at 8:45 p.m., Caroline said. Carrying 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases and what appeared to be several items of jewelry, she has not returned. Evelyn felt something that might have been satisfaction, but mostly just felt sad. Amber hadn't loved Daniel. She'd loved what Daniel represented: money, status, the lifestyle of a successful tech founder's girlfriend. The moment that disappeared, so did she. Mr. Moore spent the rest of the evening making increasingly desperate calls, Caroline continued. He contacted his lawyer 17 times, his accountant 9 times, his board members, his investors, several business associates. By midnight, he'd started calling former colleagues, people he hadn't spoken to in years, anyone who might have access to emergency capital. No one helped, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No one helped, Caroline confirmed. Most didn't even answer. The few who did made excuses and ended the calls quickly. Word travels fast in Seattle's tech community. By 10 p.m. last night, everyone knew Moore Technologies was in trouble. She pulled out another document, this one dense with financial figures. His personal account shows some interesting activity. At 11 p.m., he attempted to wire $200,000 from his primary checking account to an offshore account in the Caymans. The transfer was flagged and frozen by his bank pending fraud investigation. Evelyn's eyebrows rose. He was trying to hide money? Unsuccessfully, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. I may have mentioned to certain banking contacts that Mr. Moore's financial activities warranted additional scrutiny. Given the pending SEC investigation, they were quite eager to cooperate. Caroline flipped to another page. This morning at 6 a.m., Mr. Moore's lawyer filed an emergency motion to reopen the divorce settlement, claiming procedural irregularities. Evelyn's hand tightened on her coffee cup. Can he do that? He can file whatever he wants, Marcus said calmly. Judge Henley will laugh it out of her courtroom. You accepted nothing, Evelyn. There's no settlement to dispute. But it shows how desperate Daniel is becoming. He's looking for any angle, any leverage. He's looking for me, Evelyn said quietly. He thinks I have answers. You do have answers, Marcus agreed. You're just not obligated to give them to him. Caroline cleared her throat delicately. There's one more thing. This morning at 7:30, Mr. Moore showed up at your previous residence. Evelyn went very still. The Fremont apartment? Yes. He didn't have a key, of course, since it was never in his name. He spent 20 minutes trying to convince your landlord to let him in. When that failed, he attempted to force the door. Building security removed him from the premises and banned him from the property. The thought of Daniel at her little studio apartment, the place she'd fled to when she couldn't take his house anymore, the sanctuary where she'd slowly rebuilt some sense of self, made Evelyn's stomach turn. He's looking for evidence, she said, something he can use to prove I was planning this, that I wasn't really the pathetic housewife I appeared to be. He won't find anything, Marcus said, because you were smart enough not to leave anything to find. No paper trail, no email communications with me, nothing that suggests you were anything other than what you appeared to be. That was true. Evelyn had been meticulous about it. Every conversation with her father had been on burner phones, purchased with cash, destroyed after use. Every document, every plan, every piece of the puzzle that was slowly being assembled, all of it existed in Marcus's world, not hers. In her Fremont apartment, in her life as a barista named Eve, there was nothing to connect her to Marcus Vale except DNA. What happens now? Evelyn asked, looking between her father and Caroline. Marcus and Caroline exchanged a glance that suggested they'd been waiting for this question. Now, Marcus said, we accelerate the timeline. I was planning to let this play out over a few weeks. Let Daniel exhaust himself trying to save his sinking ship. But his attempt to access your apartment suggests he's more unstable than I anticipated. I don't like unpredictable variables. Meaning? Meaning we finish this today. Caroline pulled out yet another document. This one looked official, heavy with legal language and corporate seals. Moore Technologies' board of directors has been scheduled for an emergency meeting at 2 p.m. this afternoon. All 7 board members will be attending. They're expecting a presentation from Mr. Moore explaining the company's financial situation and his plan for addressing the Thornhill Capital debt. They're expecting a presentation he can't possibly give, Evelyn said, understanding dawning. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Because the real financial situation is catastrophic, and his only plan has been to keep borrowing money until the problems magically solved themselves, which, as it turns out, is not a viable business strategy. During that meeting, Caroline continued, I will be presenting the board with documentation of Mr. Moore's financial mismanagement, including falsified revenue reports, unauthorized expenditures, and evidence of fraud in his investor presentations. The board will vote to remove him as CEO effective immediately. And then, Evelyn asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. And then I walk in, Marcus said simply. As the majority shareholder through Thornhill Capital and its parent companies, I have the authority to appoint new leadership. I'll be installing a temporary CEO while we restructure the company and conduct a full audit. The employees? Evelyn couldn't help asking. Some of them had been her friends, back when she was allowed to have friends. Good people who'd believed in the company's mission and worked hard to make it succeed. The employees will be fine, Marcus assured her. Better than fine. Most of them have been underpaid and overworked while Daniel threw money at his own lifestyle. We'll be correcting that. The company itself is solid. You built the foundation well. It just needs actual leadership instead of a narcissist playing CEO. Evelyn set down her coffee cup, her hands not quite steady. You're really doing this? Today. I'm really doing this, Marcus confirmed. But Evelyn, there's something else, something I need you to decide. She looked at him, waiting. I want you there, he said. At the board meeting. I want you to walk into that conference room and I want Daniel Moore to see exactly who you are. Not the pathetic ex-wife he humiliated in court. Not the silent woman he erased from his company's history. The woman who built the technology he's been taking credit for. The daughter of the man who owns his entire future. Evelyn's heart was suddenly pounding. Marcus, you don't have to, he said quickly. If you'd rather stay out of it, let me handle this without you being present. I understand completely. This is my revenge, not yours. You've already survived him. You don't owe anyone a performance. But, Evelyn prompted, because she could hear the unspoken word. But, Marcus continued quietly, I think you'd regret not being there. I think part of you needs to see his face when he realizes the truth. When he understands that the woman he threw away was the only valuable thing he ever had. Evelyn stood and walked to the windows. Below, Seattle was going about its Saturday morning routine. Tourists heading to Pike Place Market, locals jogging along the waterfront, the ferries making their endless crossings of the Sound, normal people living normal lives that didn't include divorce courts and corporate warfare, and fathers who bought companies just to destroy the men who'd hurt their daughters. What time is the meeting? She asked without turning around. 2 p.m. at the Moore Technologies headquarters in Bellevue. That's Daniel's building, his territory. Not anymore, Marcus said. As of 8 a.m. this morning, when Thornhill Capital officially called in its debt, that building belongs to me. Daniel just doesn't know it yet. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, watching the water and the sky and thinking about all the times she'd walked into that building as Daniel's wife. How she'd smiled at the receptionist and taken the elevator to the top floor and sat in on meetings where her husband presented her ideas as his own. How she'd stayed quiet because he'd convinced her it was strategic. How she'd made herself small because he needed to be big. How she'd lost herself piece by piece until she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She turned to face her father. I'll be there, but I want to walk in on my own terms. Marcus smiled, and it was fierce and proud. Name them. I want to arrive separately, not with you. I want to walk into that building as myself, not as your daughter first. I want Daniel to see me before he understands the connection. Done. What else? Evelyn thought about it, about what she needed to reclaim herself completely. I want my work credited properly. In the company records, in the patents, everywhere Daniel erased me. I want my name back on everything I built. Already in progress, Caroline said, making a note in her portfolio. The legal team has been preparing the documentation for weeks. Once the board votes to remove Mr. Moore, we'll be filing corrections with the patent office and updating all internal records. And I want to speak, Evelyn said, surprised by her own certainty. At the meeting. I want to tell them the truth about who built that company. Marcus stood and crossed to where she stood by the windows. He put a hand on her shoulder, and his expression was serious. Are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back. Daniel will know. The whole tech community will know. Your privacy, your anonymity. It's gone. I've been hiding for 6 years, Evelyn said quietly. I'm done hiding. Then we do this properly, Marcus said. Caroline, call the team. Tell them Ms. Vale will be making a presentation at the board meeting. I want full documentation prepared. Every line of code she wrote, every algorithm she developed, every design decision Daniel took credit for. I want proof that's absolutely unassailable. Yes, sir. Caroline was already typing on her phone. James spoke for the first time since breakfast began. Ms. Vale will need security. If Moore is unstable enough to force his way into her apartment, he's unstable enough to try something at the office. Agreed, Marcus said. James, you'll accompany her, and I want 2 additional security personnel present at the building. Already arranged, James said calmly. Thompson and Wade are en route from Portland. They'll be in position by 1 p.m. Evelyn looked at the 3 of them, her father orchestrating the destruction of her ex-husband's life with the same efficiency he brought to billion-dollar mergers, Caroline documenting every detail with clinical precision, James planning security measures like they were protecting a head of state instead of a barista from Fremont. It was surreal. It was overwhelming. It was exactly what she needed. What should I wear? She asked, and was slightly embarrassed by how practical the question sounded given the magnitude of what they were planning. Marcus smiled. Whatever makes you feel powerful. This is your moment, Evelyn. Dress for the woman you are, not the woman Daniel tried to make you. 2 hours later, Evelyn stood in front of the suite's full-length mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her wore a tailored navy suit that fit like it had been made for her body specifically, which, given that it had appeared in the closet overnight alongside several other options, it probably had been. The skirt hit just above her knees, professional but not matronly. The jacket was cut to emphasize her shoulders, her posture, her presence. Underneath was a simple white silk blouse. Her shoes were Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to her height and somehow made her feel like she could walk through walls. Her hair, which she'd worn in a hasty ponytail for months, had been professionally styled by someone Marcus had brought to the suite. It fell in soft waves past her shoulders, framing her face in a way that made her look both elegant and formidable. Minimal makeup, just enough to highlight her features without hiding behind it. She looked like money, like power, like someone who belonged in boardrooms and corner offices. She looked like Marcus Vale's daughter. "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked from the doorway. He was dressed for battle himself, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than some people's cars, a white shirt, a steel gray tie that matched his eyes. Together they looked like exactly what they were, people who could buy and sell entire companies before lunch. "I'm sure," Evelyn said, and was relieved to find that her voice was steady. "Caroline has prepared a dossier for you, everything you need to present your case. But, Evelyn..." He paused, and something softer crossed his usually controlled features. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You know that, right? Not to that board, not to Daniel, not to anyone. You're brilliant and talented, and you built something extraordinary. Whether they acknowledge it or not doesn't change that." "I know," Evelyn said, "but I need them to acknowledge it anyway. I need Daniel to hear it from my mouth. I need him to understand exactly what he threw away." Marcus nodded. "Then let's go in this." They took separate cars, as Evelyn had requested. Marcus left first in the Rolls-Royce with Caroline, heading to the Moore Technologies building to prepare for the board meeting. Evelyn waited 30 minutes, using the time to review the dossier Caroline had prepared and trying to calm the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her. At 1:15, James appeared in the suite does-seat doorway. "The car is ready, Miss Vale." She stood, smoothed her jacket one final time, and followed him to the elevator. The drive to Bellevue took 25 minutes in Saturday afternoon traffic. James drove a black Mercedes S-Class that was armored, she could tell by the weight of the doors, and handled the Seattle traffic with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything else. He didn't try to make small talk, which Evelyn appreciated. She needed the silence to prepare herself for what came next. Moore Technologies was headquartered in a gleaming glass tower in downtown Bellevue, all sharp angles and expensive architecture designed to announce that the company inside was successful and modern and not to be ignored. Evelyn had been here hundreds of times, back when she was allowed to be part of the company she'd helped build. She knew every floor, every conference room, every corner where she'd hidden to cry when Daniel's cruelty became too much to bear in public. She'd hated this building. But today, looking at it through the Mercedes' tinted windows, she felt something different. Today it looked like a monument to hubris that was about to fall. James pulled into the underground parking garage, bypassing the visitor spaces and heading straight for the executive level. There were already two men waiting near the elevator, Thompson and Wade, presumably both of them with the same alert, professional bearing as James. They nodded as the Mercedes approached. "We're 15 minutes early," James said, putting the car in park. "Your father is already upstairs in the boardroom with the directors. Mr. Moore arrived 10 minutes ago. He's been in his office since, presumably preparing his presentation. Is he alone?" "His lawyer is with him, Martin Blackwell. No one else." Evelyn took a deep breath. "Okay, let's do this." James came around to open her door, and she stepped out into the concrete chill of the parking garage. Thompson and Wade fell into position on either side of her, not obviously threatening, but clearly there. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Evelyn Vale was under protection. They took the executive elevator to the 15th floor where the boardroom was located. The elevator was made of glass and chrome, designed to impress visitors as they rose through the building's atrium. Evelyn had always hated it. Too exposed, too showy, too much of Daniel's obsession with appearances over substance. Today, she stood perfectly straight as they ascended, and if anyone in the atrium below looked up, they would have seen a woman who looked like she owned the building, which, technically, her father did now. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, all polished wood and expensive artwork, and the kind of hushed quiet that came with corner offices and seven-figure salaries. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, who'd always been kind to Evelyn back when she was just Daniel's wife, looked up and her eyes went wide. "Mrs. Moore?" Kelly's confusion was obvious. I'm sorry, I heard about the divorce. I didn't mean—" "It's Ms. Vale now," Evelyn said gently. "Is the board meeting in the main conference room?" "Yes, but—" Kelly glanced toward Daniel's office nervously. "Mr. Moore didn't mention you'd be attending." "Mr. Moore doesn't know everything," Evelyn said, and walked past the reception desk toward the conference room. Behind her, she heard Kelly pick up the phone, probably to warn Daniel that his ex-wife had just arrived. That was fine. Let him panic. Let him try to figure out what was happening. The conference room doors were closed, but she could see through the glass walls that the board members were already assembled. 7 of them, ranging in age from early 40s to late 60s, all of them people who'd invested time and money into Moore Technologies based on Daniel's promises and presentations, based on her work that he'd claimed as his own. Marcus sat at the head of the table, looking perfectly comfortable in the position of power. Caroline stood beside him with a laptop and several folders of documentation. The board members looked worried, whispering among themselves about why they'd been called in on a Saturday for an emergency meeting. Evelyn paused with her hand on the door handle. This was it. The moment where she stopped being the victim in Daniel Moore's story and became the author of her own. She pushed open the door and walked in. The room went silent. 7 faces turned to stare at her, confusion, surprise, and in one case, recognition flickering across their features. Marcus didn't look surprised, because of course he'd been expecting her. But he did smile, small and proud and entirely for her benefit. "Gentlemen," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden quiet, Thank you for allowing me to join you. I believe I have some things you need to hear. One of the board members, Richard Chen, she remembered, venture capitalist and early investor, found his voice first. Mrs. Moore? What are you doing here? This is a closed board meeting. It's Ms. Vale, she corrected, moving to stand beside Marcus at the head of the table. And I'm here because this meeting concerns my work that's been attributed to someone else for far too long. Another board member, Patricia Williams, leaned forward with interest. Your work? I'm sorry, but I don't understand. The conference room door slammed open. Daniel Moore stood in the doorway, his lawyer right behind him, and his face was twisted with fury and confusion and something that might have been fear. What the hell is this? He demanded, staring at Evelyn like she was a ghost that had no business being solid. Evelyn, what are you doing here? You can't just walk into my board meeting. It's not your board meeting anymore, Mr. Moore, Marcus said mildly, not even bothering to stand. Please, sit down. We were just about to begin. Daniel's eyes finally landed on Marcus, really seeing him for the first time since the courthouse steps. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully, across his face. You, he breathed. You were in the car yesterday, outside the courthouse. His gaze swung between Marcus and Evelyn, and she could see his mind racing, trying to connect dots that he'd been too arrogant to notice before. Who are you? Marcus smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. I'm Marcus Vale, Evelyn's father, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, I'm the majority owner of your company. He gestured to an empty chair. Now sit down, Daniel. It's time you learned exactly how badly you've miscalculated. Daniel didn't sit down. He stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions so quickly it was almost comical. Shock, confusion, denial, and finally a desperate kind of anger that came from a man realizing the ground beneath him had already disappeared. That's not possible, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. You can't. Thornhill Capital is my investor. You can't just take over a company because the CEO has been committing fraud, Marcus interrupted smoothly, because he's been falsifying revenue reports to investors, because he's been running a burn rate that would bankrupt the company in 6 months while telling everyone the business is thriving. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards and knew it. Actually, Daniel, I can do exactly that. And I have. Martin Blackwell, Daniel's lawyer, had gone pale. He was rapidly typing something on his phone, probably trying to verify what Marcus was saying, probably already realizing that his client had walked into something far worse than a difficult board meeting. This is insane, Daniel said, but the bluster in his voice was hollow. You can't just show up and His eyes landed on Evelyn again, and something ugly twisted across his face. This is you. You planned this. You and your... He gestured wildly at Marcus. Your sugar daddy, or whoever the hell this is? Her father, Marcus said, and his voice went cold enough to freeze nitrogen. I'm her father, Mr. Moore. The father you never bothered to research when you married his daughter. The father she called crying from a bathroom floor because you'd terrified her so badly she locked herself away from you. The father who has spent the last 2 years systematically acquiring every piece of leverage necessary to destroy you the moment she was free of you legally. The board members were staring now, various degrees of understanding dawning on their faces. Patricia Williams had pulled out her own phone and was clearly searching something, probably Marcus Vale's name, probably realizing exactly who was sitting at the head of their conference table. Richard Chen spoke up, his voice careful. Mr. Vale, I think we all deserve an explanation of what's happening here. You're claiming ownership of more technologies through Thornhill Capital? I'm not claiming it, Marcus said. I'm stating a fact. Thornhill Capital led your Series B funding round 3 years ago with a $15 million investment. Thornhill is a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings, which is owned by Slayton Associates, which is a private equity group I control. I have owned the controlling interest in this company for 2 years, 4 months. I simply chose not to exercise that control until today. He nodded to Caroline, who opened her laptop and pulled up a presentation on the conference room's large screen. Corporate ownership structures appeared, flowcharts showing the maze of holding companies and subsidiaries that all led back to Marcus Vale. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Marcus continued, Thornhill Capital officially called in its debt to Moore Technologies. The outstanding amount, including accrued interest and penalties for the financial irregularities we've documented, is $47 million, due in full within 30 days as stipulated in the original investment agreement. Daniel finally moved, stumbling to the table and gripping the back of an empty chair. We don't have that kind of liquidity. You know we don't have that. No tech company keeps that much cash on hand. Then you should have been more careful about how you spent my money, Marcus said simply. The Bellevue penthouse at $3.2 million. The Ferrari you crashed last summer and replaced with a Lamborghini. The private box at the Seahawks games. The memberships at 3 different country clubs. Shall I continue? Caroline pulled up another slide, this one showing Daniel's personal expenditures over the last 2 years. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands on cars, clothes, entertainment, travel. Money flowing out of the company and into Daniel's lifestyle like water from a broken pipe. Those were business expenses, Daniel protested weakly. Networking, client entertainment. Taking your mistress to Paris on the company jet is not a business expense, Marcus said. Neither is buying her a diamond bracelet that costs more than your average employee's annual salary. We have receipts for everything, Daniel. Every fraudulent expense report, every inflated invoice, every dollar you stole from the company while telling your employees there wasn't money for proper salaries or benefits. One of the board members, James Martinez, Evelyn recognized him now, cleared his throat. Mr. Vale, this is all very concerning, but I'm still not clear on why Mrs. Moore, Ms. Vale, is present at this meeting. Because, Evelyn said, speaking for the first time since Daniel had entered the room, and her voice was steady and clear and nothing like the quiet whisper she'd used in the courtroom yesterday. Everything valuable about this company came from me, and I think it's time everyone knew that. Daniel's head snapped toward her. You never… He stopped, his brain clearly struggling to process what she was saying against what he'd believed for 6 years. You stayed home, you didn't work, you contributed nothing. I wrote the core algorithm that makes your flagship product function, Evelyn said calmly. The one you presented to this board 3 years ago as your own revolutionary breakthrough in data encryption. I designed the user interface that made it accessible to non-technical users. I developed the security protocols that protect your clients' data. I built the foundation this company stands on, and you took credit for every single piece of it. The room had gone absolutely silent. Caroline pulled up another slide, this one showing lines of code with timestamps and user IDs. This is the original repository for what became the Moore Technologies encryption algorithm. The commits are all attributed to user EV2847. That's Ms. Vale's developer ID from when she worked alongside Mr. Moore in the early days of the company. That doesn't prove anything, Martin interjected, finally finding his voice. User IDs can be faked, timestamps can be altered. Which is why we also have her master's thesis from MIT, Caroline continued smoothly, pulling up a new document. Written 4 years before Moore Technologies was founded. The theoretical framework that became your encryption algorithm is laid out in complete detail. Ms. Vale's name is on the title page. Her advisor's signature is on the approval form. It's been in MIT's digital archives since 2018. She pulled up another document. We also have email communications between Ms. Vale and Mr. Moore from their first year of marriage, discussing the company's technical development. Ms. Vale explaining algorithms. Mr. Moore asking for clarification on her work, her suggesting improvements, him agreeing to implement them. We also have statements from 3 former employees, Marcus added, who remember Ms. Vale working in the office during the first 2 years of the company, who remember her writing code, attending technical meetings, solving problems that Mr. Moore couldn't. All 3 of them are willing to testify under oath about her contributions. Daniel was shaking his head, over and over, like he could deny reality through sheer force of will. No, you're lying, you're making this up to what? Evelyn asked, and there was something almost pitying in her voice now. To take your company? Daniel, we already have your company. My father owns it. We don't need to lie about anything. She stood, moving to the presentation screen, and Caroline handed her a remote control. Evelyn pulled up a new slide, this one showing a photograph of a whiteboard covered in equations and diagrams. The photo was dated 5 years earlier. "This is from our apartment in Capitol Hill," Evelyn said, "from when we were still working together, before the money came. Before you decided my contributions were less important than your presentations. That's my handwriting on that board, Daniel. Those are my equations that became your product." Another slide. Code snippets with detailed comments explaining complex security functions. "This is my work," Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "This is my innovation, my intelligence, my years of education and development. You presented it to investors as yours. You built a company on it. You became wealthy and successful because of it. And you made me believe that I was worthless, that I contributed nothing, that I should be grateful you even kept me around." She turned to face him directly, and Daniel actually stepped back from the force of her gaze. "But I was never worthless," Evelyn said quietly. "I was the only thing of value you ever had, and you threw me away like I was nothing." Patricia Williams spoke into the heavy silence that followed. "Ms. Vale, if what you're saying is true, and the documentation certainly seems to support it, why didn't you ever speak up? Why let him take credit for your work?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, remembering those early days, the slow erosion of her confidence. The way Daniel had convinced her that their success depended on him being the face of the company. The way she'd made herself smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared. "Because I loved him," she said finally, "and I believed him when he said it was temporary. That once the company was established, once we had the funding and the recognition, he would acknowledge my contributions. I believed we were a team." She smiled, and it was bitter. "I was young and stupid and too trusting. By the time I realized he had no intention of ever sharing credit, my name had been erased from everything. The patents, the company history, even the memories of employees who'd seen me work. I became invisible." "But you're not invisible anymore," Marcus said, standing to join her at the front of the room, "and Daniel Moore is going to face the consequences of treating you as if you were." Daniel had sunk into a chair now, his face gray, his hands shaking slightly. Martin was whispering urgently in his ear, but Daniel didn't seem to be hearing him. He was staring at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time. "I want to vote," Marcus said, turning to address the board members. "As the majority shareholder, I'm calling for the immediate removal of Daniel Moore as CEO of Moore Technologies, effective today. All in favor?" The board members looked at each other. Some of them had worked with Daniel for years, had believed in his vision, had trusted his leadership, but they'd also just seen irrefutable evidence of fraud, mismanagement, and stolen intellectual property. Richard Chen raised his hand first, then Patricia Williams, then James Martinez. One by one, all 7 board members voted to remove Daniel Moore from the company he'd built on someone else's genius. "The motion passes unanimously," Marcus said. "Mr. Moore, you are no longer the CEO of this company. You're no longer employed by this company in any capacity. You have 1 hour to clear out your personal belongings from your office, and then building security will escort you from the premises." Daniel finally found his voice, and it came out as a strangled whisper. "You can't do this. This is my company. I built this." "You built nothing," Evelyn said, and her voice was harder now, all the softness burned away by years of pain. "You took what I built and put your name on it. You told the world you were a genius while I made coffee and smiled quietly in the corner. You convinced everyone, including me, that you deserved all the credit and I deserved none. But that ends today." She pulled up a final slide, this one showing patent applications with Daniel's name being crossed out and replaced with her own. "We're filing corrections with the U.S. Patent Office on Monday," Caroline said. "Every patent that was filed in Mr. Moore's name for technology that Ms. Vale developed will be corrected to show her as the primary inventor. Every paper, every presentation, every piece of company history, we're correcting the record." "You'll be destroyed," Daniel said, looking at Evelyn with something close to desperation now. "You'll be investigated, accused of fraud yourself for hiding this for so long." "No," Marcus interrupted. "She'll be recognized as a brilliant innovator who was taken advantage of by her husband. She'll be sympathetic. A victim who finally found the courage to speak up. You, on the other hand, will be the villain in this story. The man who stole his wife's work and built an empire on lies." Martin Blackwell stood abruptly. This meeting is over. My client will not be participating in this witch hunt any further. We'll be seeking legal counsel, and your client should seek legal counsel, Marcus agreed, because the SEC investigation I mentioned yesterday. It's very real. They'll be here Monday morning with subpoenas for all company financial records. I suspect they're going to find some very interesting discrepancies between what Daniel reported to investors and what actually happened with that money. He turned back to Daniel, and his expression was implacable. You humiliated my daughter in open court. You spent years making her believe she was worthless. You stole her work, her identity, and 6 years of her life. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Daniel's phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. He pulled it out with shaking hands and stared at the screen. Even from across the room, Evelyn could see the notifications flooding in. News alerts, probably. The story was already breaking. How? Daniel whispered, still staring at his phone. How did you? I told you, Marcus said. I've been planning this for 2 years. Did you think I'd leave anything to chance? Every reporter in Seattle received a carefully curated information package about 20 minutes ago. By tonight, your face will be on every tech news site in the country, and the story will be about the CEO who stole his wife's innovations and committed fraud to cover his incompetence. Patricia Williams was looking at her own phone now, her expression carefully neutral. It's already trending on Twitter. TechCrunch just posted an article. Daniel stood so abruptly, his chair fell backward. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might try to attack someone. Her, Marcus, anyone who'd contributed to the destruction of his life. But James and the other security personnel shifted position slightly, and Daniel seemed to remember where he was. This isn't over, he said, but the words had no force behind them. I'll fight this. I'll sue. With what money? Marcus asked pleasantly. Your personal accounts are frozen pending the fraud investigation. Your company's stock is worthless as of today. We'll be doing a full restructuring that dilutes all existing shares to nothing. The penthouse is being seized to cover your debts. Your car lease is being terminated. Even your country club memberships have been canceled. You have nothing, Daniel, just like you told Evelyn she had yesterday. The cruelty in Marcus's voice was precise and calculated. This wasn't anger. This was justice being administered by someone who had the resources to make it absolute. You have 1 hour, Caroline said, checking her watch. I suggest you use it wisely. Martin grabbed Daniel's arm, trying to steer him toward the door, but Daniel shook him off. He looked at Evelyn one last time, and she saw it all in his face. The realization of what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away, what he'd destroyed through his own arrogance. Evelyn, he said, and her name sounded broken in his mouth. You can't. We were married. We built this together. You can't just. We didn't build anything together, Evelyn said quietly. I built it. You took credit for it, and then you threw me away. So yes, Daniel, I can absolutely just. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, something that might change the trajectory of this disaster, but no words came. What was there to say? The evidence was overwhelming. The board had voted. His company was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His future was a smoking crater. Martin finally succeeded in pulling him toward the door. Daniel walked like a man in shock, his movements mechanical, his eyes unfocused. At the doorway, he paused and looked back one final time. Evelyn met his gaze steadily, and she didn't look away. This was the last time she would see him as anything other than a cautionary tale, the last time he would have any power to hurt her, the last moment of the story where he mattered at all. Then he was gone, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The conference room was silent for a long moment. Then Richard Chen let out a long breath and looked at Marcus with something like awe. That was the most ruthlessly efficient corporate execution I've ever witnessed, he said. Thank you, Marcus said, without a trace of irony. Patricia Williams turned to Evelyn. Ms. Vale, I want to apologize. If we'd known, if any of us had known what was happening, you had no reason to question the narrative Daniel presented, Evelyn said. He was convincing. That's what he's good at, telling stories and making people believe them. What happens to the company now? James Martinez asked. To the employees, the products, the contracts? The company will be fine, Marcus assured him. Better than fine. We'll be installing new leadership, conducting a full audit, and restructuring to ensure this kind of mismanagement never happens again. The technology is solid because Evelyn built it well. We just need to run it properly. He looked at the board members, his expression serious. I'm giving each of you a choice. You can stay on the board under the new structure, or you can resign with full buyout of your shares at fair market value. I won't hold it against anyone who chooses to leave. This has been an intense afternoon, and I understand if you don't want to be associated with the fallout. The board members exchanged glances. Patricia spoke first. I'll stay. If Ms. Vale is involved in the new structure, I want to be part of ensuring she gets the recognition she deserves. One by one, the others agreed. They would stay. They would help rebuild. The meeting concluded with logistics and paperwork and arrangements for the transition. Caroline distributed documents, scheduled follow-up meetings, and generally orchestrated the orderly transfer of power with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Evelyn found herself standing at the conference room windows, looking out over Bellevue and the gray waters of Lake Washington beyond. Somewhere in this building, Daniel was clearing out his office. Somewhere in Seattle, reporters were writing articles about his downfall. Somewhere in the world that had celebrated him as an innovative genius, people were learning the truth. She waited to feel triumphant, or satisfied, or something. Instead, she just felt tired. Marcus appeared beside her, his presence solid and comforting. You okay? I don't know, Evelyn admitted. I thought this would feel different. Better, maybe. Revenge rarely feels as good as we think it will, Marcus said quietly. What feels good is knowing it's over, that he can't hurt you anymore, that the truth is finally out there. Is it over? Evelyn asked. He'll fight back. Try to salvage something. He'll try, Marcus agreed, and he'll fail. Evelyn, by Monday morning, every door in the tech industry will be closed to him. Every investor who might have taken his call won't answer. Every company that might have hired him will see the fraud investigation and run the other way. He's done, completely. Through the window, Evelyn could see Daniel emerge from the building's main entrance. He was carrying a single cardboard box, the sum total of his personal belongings after 6 years as CEO. No security detail, no driver waiting, no amber hanging on his arm. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking lost, then started walking toward the parking garage. His movements were those of a man who'd aged 20 years in 2 hours. Evelyn watched him disappear from view and felt something inside her finally relax. It was over. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and smiled. The SEC agents just arrived at the building. They'll want to interview you eventually, but Caroline will handle all of that. You don't have to worry about anything except deciding what you want to do next. What I want to do next, Evelyn repeated quietly. She'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through the divorce, on enduring Daniel's final cruelties, that she hadn't really thought about what came after. You could work here, Marcus suggested. Take an active role in the company you built. I'm sure the new CEO, whoever we hire, would be thrilled to have the actual genius behind the technology on staff. Maybe, Evelyn said. Or maybe I want to build something new. Something that's mine from the beginning. Something he never touched. Marcus smiled, proud and fierce. Now that sounds like my daughter. They left the building together an hour later after the board members had departed and Caroline had finished coordinating with building security and the SEC agents and the small army of people required to legally dismantle someone's life. James drove them back to the Four Seasons as the Seattle afternoon faded into evening, the sky turning from gray to charcoal to black. Evelyn's phone had been buzzing constantly. Reporters requesting interviews, old friends who'd seen the news reaching out, strangers offering support or asking questions. She'd turned it off eventually, unable to process the sudden attention after years of invisibility. It's going to be intense for a while, Marcus warned as they rode the elevator back to the suite. The press will want the story. All of it. Your marriage, the abuse, the stolen work, everything. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. But it might help, Evelyn said slowly, understanding dawning. Other women in similar situations. Other people whose work has been stolen. My story could help them. It could, Marcus agreed, but only if you're ready to tell it. There's no rush, Evelyn. You've already done the hard part. The suite felt different when they entered, less like a hotel room and more like a sanctuary. James took up his position near the door while Marcus poured them both drinks. Whiskey for him, wine for her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights spread out below them like scattered diamonds. What happened to Amber? Evelyn asked eventually. Daniel's girlfriend. Marcus smiled. Last I heard, she was on a plane to Los Angeles. Apparently she has an ex-boyfriend there who's doing quite well in entertainment. She moves fast when the money disappears. She never cared about him. No, but then he never really cared about her either. She was just a trophy, a symbol of his success. When the success disappeared, so did the symbol. Marcus sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. They deserved each other, honestly. Evelyn's phone, still turned off in her purse, seemed to pulse with the weight of all those unread messages. She knew she'd have to deal with them eventually. The reporters, the questions, the sudden notoriety of being the woman who'd brought down Daniel Moore. But not tonight. Tonight she was just Evelyn Vale sitting in her father's hotel suite, finally free of the man who'd tried to erase her. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. For coming when I called. For planning all of this. For... Her voice caught slightly. For believing me when I told you what he'd done. Marcus set down his glass and looked at her with an expression she'd rarely seen on his usually controlled face, pure, unconditional love. Evelyn, you're my daughter, my only child. There is nothing I wouldn't do to protect you, nothing I wouldn't destroy to keep you safe. He paused, and something harder entered his voice. Daniel Moore learned that the hard way. Anyone else who tries to hurt you will learn it too. Later that night, lying in the expensive hotel bed and staring at the ceiling, Evelyn thought about everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. The courtroom, the divorce, Marcus stepping out of that Rolls-Royce like a weapon aimed directly at Daniel's future. The board meeting, the look on Daniel's face when he finally understood what he'd lost. She thought about the woman she'd been when she married him, young and brilliant and so full of hope. The woman she'd become under his influence, quiet and diminished and almost invisible. And the woman she was now, still standing, still fighting, reclaiming everything he'd tried to take. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, reporters, questions, the messy aftermath of Daniel's destruction. The SEC investigation would drag on for months. The company restructuring would be complex. Her name correction on the patents would be a bureaucratic nightmare. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, Evelyn Vale fell asleep feeling something she'd almost forgotten. Safe. And somewhere in Bellevue, in an apartment he could barely afford because his accounts were frozen and his credit was destroyed, Daniel Moore sat in the dark and finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. But by then, it was far too late. 3 weeks later, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror in a Paris hotel suite and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Not because she'd changed, though she had, in ways both visible and not. Her hair was professionally styled, falling in elegant waves that framed a face that had lost the haunted exhaustion of the divorce proceedings. Her suit was Chanel, navy with gold buttons, fitted to perfection by tailors who understood that clothing could be armor. Her heels were Valentino, red-soled and expensive, adding 3 inches to her height and miles to her confidence. But it was her eyes that were different. They held something they hadn't held in years: certainty, purpose. The quiet knowledge that she belonged exactly where she was. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind her, already dressed in his own formal attire for the evening's event. Ready? Almost, Evelyn said, fastening a pair of diamond earrings. Her mother's, which Marcus had been keeping safe for her since she'd married Daniel and stopped wearing anything that reminded her of who she'd been before. How many people are we expecting? At the gala? About 400? Press, investors, tech industry leaders, academics, everyone who matters in European technology innovation. Marcus moved to stand beside her, and they looked at their reflections together, father and daughter, 2 people who'd systematically destroyed a man's life and felt no remorse about it. The keynote is scheduled for 9 p.m. You have your notes? I don't need notes, Evelyn said quietly. I've been living this speech for 6 years. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind that made the divorce proceedings look peaceful by comparison. The story had exploded across tech media within hours of the board meeting. CEO ousted for fraud, wife revealed as true genius behind the technology, billionaire father orchestrates perfect revenge. It had everything: corporate intrigue, stolen innovation, abuse, vindication, and the kind of dramatic reversal that made for irresistible headlines. Evelyn had given exactly one interview to a senior technology journalist at Bloomberg who'd promised fair coverage and delivered it. She'd told the truth, all of it. The isolation, the gaslighting, the systematic erasure of her contributions, the years of believing she was worthless while Daniel took credit for her brilliance. The article had been published 4 days after the board meeting, and within 24 hours it had been shared over 1 million times. The response had been overwhelming. Other women came forward with similar stories, husbands or partners who'd stolen their work, taken credit for their ideas, convinced them to stay silent while building careers on stolen genius. Tech companies started reviewing their attribution practices. Universities began investigating cases of spousal intellectual property theft. Evelyn had inadvertently started a movement. Daniel, meanwhile, had disappeared. After the board meeting, he'd spent exactly 3 days trying to salvage something from the wreckage. He'd called lawyers, threatened lawsuits, posted angry rants on social media about being framed and victimized. But every door had closed in his face. Every lawyer had declined representation after seeing the evidence. Every friend had stopped returning calls. The SEC investigation had uncovered exactly what Marcus had promised: systematic fraud, falsified revenue reports, unauthorized expenditures that totaled well into 7 figures. On the 4th day, Daniel had withdrawn his remaining accessible cash, about $8,000, from an account the investigators had somehow missed and simply vanished. No forwarding address, no social media presence, no trace. Caroline's network had tracked him to a cheap motel near SeaTac Airport, then to a Spirit Airlines flight to Fort Lauderdale, then to nothing. He'd evaporated like he'd never existed. "Good riddance," Marcus had said when Caroline reported that they'd lost Daniel's trail. "Let him disappear. Let him rebuild his life somewhere as a nobody. That's more mercy than he deserved." Evelyn had agreed. She didn't want to know where Daniel was or what he was doing. She didn't want revenge anymore. She'd already had it, completely and absolutely. She just wanted him gone from her life in every way that mattered. The hotel phone rang, and Marcus answered it. "Yes, good. We'll be down in 5 minutes." He hung up and turned to Evelyn. "The car is ready. James is waiting in the lobby." "Then let's not keep him waiting," Evelyn said, taking one last look at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was strong and successful and entirely herself. No more pretending to be smaller than she was. No more silence to make someone else comfortable. She was Evelyn Vale, and tonight the world was going to remember that name. The Global Technology Innovation Gala was being held at the Palais Garnier because apparently when Marcus Vale wanted to make a statement, he didn't do anything by half measures. The Opera House had been transformed for the evening. Red carpet entrance, photographers creating walls of flashbulbs, security personnel managing the controlled chaos of 400 wealthy and influential people all arriving at once. The Rolls-Royce pulled up to the entrance, and Evelyn could see the crowd of press already surging forward, cameras ready. This was different from Seattle. This was international media, technology publications from 3 continents, financial press who understood exactly what her story represented. "You don't have to stop for photos," Marcus said quietly. "We can walk straight through." "No," Evelyn said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I want them to see me. I want them to know I'm not hiding anymore." James opened the door, and the flash of cameras was immediate and blinding. But Evelyn stepped out with her head high, one hand smoothing her suit jacket, and met the chaos with calm. Marcus emerged behind her, his presence solid and supportive, and together they paused at the designated photo area. The questions started immediately, shouted in English and French and languages Evelyn didn't recognize, all of them asking variations of the same things. How did she feel about her ex-husband's downfall? What were her plans for the future? Would she be taking over more technologies? Was the abuse as bad as the articles suggested? Evelyn smiled and waved and said nothing, letting Marcus guide her toward the entrance with James running interference against the more aggressive photographers. This wasn't the time for interviews. Tonight was about something bigger. Inside, the Palais Garnier was breathtaking, all gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, and the kind of opulent beauty that came from an era when excess was considered artistic. The gala attendees were already mingling in the grand foyer, champagne glasses in hand, conversations humming with the particular energy of people who controlled billions of dollars and knew it. Heads turned as Evelyn entered. She could feel the weight of their attention, the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. That's her. That's Evelyn Vale. That's the woman who brought down Daniel Moore. That's Marcus Vale's daughter. A server appeared with champagne, and Evelyn accepted a glass gratefully. The bubbles were perfect, expensive, exactly the kind of detail that made events like this memorable. "Ms. Vale," a voice called out, and Evelyn turned to see Patricia Williams approaching, the board member who'd voted to oust Daniel, looking elegant in a black evening gown. "I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to introduce you to some people who are very interested in your work." What followed was an hour of introductions and conversations that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. CEOs of major tech companies wanted to discuss her encryption algorithms. Venture capitalists wanted to know about her plans for future projects. Academics from Oxford and Cambridge wanted to offer her research positions. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of the genius that Daniel Moore had tried to hide. Evelyn handled it with grace she didn't entirely feel, answering questions and accepting compliments while Marcus stayed close enough to intervene if anyone got too aggressive or intrusive. But mostly people were respectful, even admiring. She was a survivor who'd reclaimed her power. In a room full of people who valued strength and intelligence above all else, that made her fascinating. At 8:30, Caroline appeared at Evelyn's elbow with a gentle reminder that the keynote was in 30 minutes, and she might want to review the venue. Evelyn excused herself from a conversation with a Swiss investor who wanted to fund her next venture, whatever it might be, and followed Caroline through the crowds toward the main auditorium. The Palais Garnier's auditorium was magnificent, tier upon tier of red velvet seats rising toward a ceiling painted with Chagall's famous mural. A stage had been set up with a podium and a massive screen for presentations. 400 seats, and every single one was filled. "They're all here for you," Caroline said quietly, showing Evelyn to a private seating area off stage. "Every tech journalist who matters, every investor who's anyone. This is your moment, Evelyn. Whatever you say tonight will be heard around the world by morning." Evelyn nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle over her shoulders. She'd been given a platform that most people never got, a chance to tell her story on her own terms, to make it mean something beyond personal vindication. She couldn't waste it. At 9 p.m. exactly, the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the auditorium. Marcus walked onto the stage to warm applause, looking completely comfortable in front of hundreds of people who collectively controlled trillions in assets. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying easily through the excellent acoustics. "Thank you all for being here tonight. The Global Technology Innovation Gala has always been about recognizing excellence, celebrating breakthrough achievements, and honoring the people who push our industry forward. Tonight, we're doing all of that by honoring someone who embodies everything this gala represents: innovation, perseverance, and the courage to claim credit for work that rightfully belongs to her." He paused, letting the anticipation build. "My daughter's story has been in the news lately. You all know the headlines: stolen work, abusive marriage, dramatic corporate takedown. But what you might not know is that none of that would have been necessary if our industry had better systems for protecting innovators, especially women, especially those who are pressured into silence by people they trust." The auditorium was absolutely silent now, every person leaning forward slightly to hear what came next. Tonight, Evelyn will be speaking about her experience, her work, and her vision for making sure what happened to her doesn't happen to others. But first, I want to say something as her father. Marcus's voice softened slightly, became more personal. "I am proud beyond measure of the woman she is. Not because she survived, not because she got revenge, but because she never stopped being brilliant, even when someone was trying to convince her she was worthless. Please welcome Evelyn Vale." The applause was immediate and thunderous as Evelyn walked onto the stage. She could see faces in the audience, some she recognized from the tech world, others from academia, still others from the press corps who'd been following her story. All of them watching, waiting to hear what she would say. She reached the podium and took a moment to look out at the crowd, at this room full of powerful people who would listen to her not because of who her father was, but because of what she'd accomplished and survived. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady and clear. 3 weeks ago, I walked out of a courthouse in Seattle thinking my life was over. My marriage had ended in humiliation. I had no job, no money, no plan beyond surviving the next day. I thought I had lost everything. She paused, letting that image sit with the audience. But the truth is, I hadn't lost anything. Because everything valuable about who I am, my intelligence, my creativity, my resilience, was still there. It had been there all along. I'd just been convinced to hide it, to make it small, to let someone else take credit for it while I stayed silent. Evelyn pulled up her first slide, the photograph of the whiteboard from the Capitol Hill apartment, covered in her equations and her handwriting. This is where more technologies actually began, not in a polished office or a funded startup space, in a cramped apartment with a woman and a man working together to build something innovative. Except somewhere along the way, one person decided that together meant only one name would be remembered, and that name wasn't mine. She walked them through it then, the slow erosion of her identity, the systematic removal of her name from patents and papers, the meetings where her ideas were presented as someone else's brilliance. She showed them the code she'd written, the algorithms she'd developed, the security protocols that had made more technologies valuable. She proved, beyond any possible doubt, that the genius everyone had attributed to Daniel Moore had actually come from her. The audience was rapt, and Evelyn could see the mixture of anger and recognition on many faces. How many people in this room had similar stories? How many had stayed silent because speaking up seemed impossible? "I'm not here tonight to talk about revenge," Evelyn continued, moving to her next slide. "Statistics on gender disparities in tech patents, on spousal intellectual property theft, on the systematic undervaluing of women's contributions to innovation. I'm here to talk about change, about creating systems that protect innovators regardless of who they're married to or dating or working alongside, about making sure that brilliance is credited to the people who created it, not the people who presented it most convincingly." She outlined her proposal then, a nonprofit foundation funded by her father but run independently that would provide legal support to people whose intellectual property had been stolen by partners or colleagues. Free patent assistance, free legal representation, resources for documentation and proof. Everything she'd needed but hadn't had when Daniel was erasing her from her own work. "We're calling it the Attribution Project," Evelyn said, pulling up the logo that Caroline's team had designed. "Because everyone deserves credit for what they create, and no one should have to choose between love and recognition, between staying silent and being erased." The applause started before she'd even finished the sentence, building to a standing ovation that made Evelyn's throat tight with emotion. These people, cynical investors and hardened journalists and academics who'd seen everything, were standing for her story, for the change she was trying to create. She waited for the applause to die down before continuing with the final part of her speech. "In the last 3 weeks, I've been asked hundreds of times how I feel about what happened to my ex-husband, how it feels to watch his life fall apart, whether I'm satisfied with his destruction." Evelyn paused, choosing her words carefully. "The truth is, I don't think about him much anymore. He took 6 years of my life, but I'm not going to give him any more time than that. He's not worth my energy or my anger or my attention." She pulled up a final slide, a photograph of herself at MIT, young and brilliant and full of hope, holding up her thesis with a genuine smile. "This is who I was before I met Daniel Moore. And this," she gestured to herself, standing on the stage in front of 400 people, "is who I am now that he's gone. Stronger, wiser, ready to build something that's entirely mine. He didn't break me. He tried, but he failed. And I want everyone watching this, everyone in a similar situation, everyone who's been silenced or erased or convinced they're worthless, I want you to know that you can survive it too. You can reclaim your power. You can rebuild." The standing ovation this time was even longer, and Evelyn had to blink back tears as she looked out at the crowd. Marcus was standing in the wings, his expression proud and fierce. Caroline was filming on her phone, probably already preparing to release the speech to press outlets worldwide. James stood near the stage entrance, alert as always, but even he was smiling slightly. When the applause finally died down, Evelyn added one last thought. I've also been asked what's next for me. Whether I'll be taking over more technologies, whether I'll be starting a new company, what my plans are for the future. And the truth is, I'm still figuring that out. For 6 years, I let someone else define what my life should be. I'm not going to make that mistake again. Whatever I build next, it will be on my terms, at my pace, with my name on it from the beginning. She smiled, and it was genuine and warm. But I can tell you this, it's going to be brilliant, because I am, and I'm done pretending otherwise. The final applause carried her off the stage and into the wings where Marcus was waiting. He pulled her into a hug, tight and fierce, and she let herself lean into it for just a moment. That was perfect, he said quietly. You were perfect. I was terrified, Evelyn admitted. You didn't show it. You looked like you owned that stage. I think I did, Evelyn said, surprised by her own confidence. For the first time in 6 years, I think I actually owned something. The rest of the evening was a blur of congratulations and networking and champagne that tasted like victory. Investors wanted to fund her next venture. Tech companies wanted to hire her. Academic institutions wanted to honor her work. The Attribution Project received commitments for over $10 million in funding before the night was over, from people who understood the importance of protecting intellectual property and supporting survivors. At midnight, Evelyn finally escaped to a quiet balcony overlooking Paris, the city lights spreading out below in a glittering carpet of gold and white. The Eiffel Tower was lit up in the distance, its hourly sparkle just beginning. The air was cool and clean, carrying none of the oppressive weight of Seattle's gray skies. She pulled out her phone, a new one, with a new number that Daniel didn't have, and scrolled through the messages that had been coming in all evening. Congratulations from former colleagues who remembered her from the early days, support from women who'd read her Bloomberg interview and felt seen, inquiries from journalists who wanted to know more about the Attribution Project, and one message from an unknown number that made her pause. I saw your speech. I'm so sorry for everything. You deserved better. You deserved everything. I hope you find happiness. D. Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment. Daniel had found a way to contact her, had watched her speech, had felt compelled to apologize. Part of her, the part that had loved him once when they were young and building something together, wanted to respond, to acknowledge his apology, to offer some kind of closure. But she didn't. Instead, she blocked the number and deleted the message. Daniel Moore didn't deserve her forgiveness or her energy or even her acknowledgement. He'd taken enough. He would get nothing more. Everything okay? Marcus appeared beside her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne despite the late hour. Everything's perfect, Evelyn said, accepting the glass and turning back to the Paris skyline. I was just thinking about how different everything looks from up here. Different how? Smaller. The things that seemed insurmountable 3 weeks ago, the divorce, the humiliation, the fear, they all look smaller now. Like I've gained altitude and can finally see that they were just obstacles, not the end of the world. Marcus clinked his glass against hers. To altitude, then, and to never being small again. To never being small again, Evelyn agreed, and drank. The next morning, Evelyn woke to find her speech trending worldwide. The video had been viewed over 5 million times. The Attribution Project had received another 20 million in funding commitments overnight. Tech publications were calling it a watershed moment for accountability and innovation. Business schools were already requesting permission to use her story in case studies about intellectual property and workplace ethics. She was, quite literally, famous. Caroline appeared at breakfast with a stack of interview requests, speaking engagement invitations, and business proposals that would take weeks to sort through. You're going to need a publicist, she said, setting the stack on the table with a thud. And probably an assistant, maybe 2 assistants. The volume of interest is unprecedented. I'll need more than that, Evelyn said, looking at the stack with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I'll need a team, people I trust, a real infrastructure to handle all this. Already on it, Marcus said, appearing with coffee that smelled like it cost more per cup than most people spent on groceries. I've been making some calls, good people, vetted thoroughly, who can help you build whatever you want to build next. Over the next week, that infrastructure took shape. Evelyn hired a chief of staff, a brilliant woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been running operations for a nonprofit in San Francisco and jumped at the chance to help build the Attribution Project. She hired a publicist who understood that Evelyn's story was about empowerment, not victimhood. She hired lawyers, accountants, and administrators who could handle the legal and financial complexity of starting a foundation. And slowly, carefully, she started to build something new. The Attribution Project launched officially 6 weeks after the Paris Gala, with offices in Seattle, New York, and London. The response was overwhelming, hundreds of people reaching out within the first week, all of them with stories similar to Evelyn's. Partners who'd stolen their work, colleagues who'd taken credit for their innovations, systems that had failed to protect them when they tried to speak up. Evelyn couldn't help everyone, but she could help some, and that was enough to start. 3 months after the divorce, Evelyn stood in the Attribution Project's Seattle office and looked around at what she'd built. A staff of 12 brilliant people working to change the system that had failed her, a budget that would support hundreds of legal cases, a growing network of volunteers, lawyers, patent experts, tech professionals who wanted to contribute to the cause. This was hers. Completely, entirely, without question hers. Miss Vale? Sarah appeared in the doorway with a tablet. You have a visitor. She says she's been trying to reach you through official channels, but wanted to speak in person. Who is it? She says her name is Amber Chen. She says you know her. Evelyn went very still. Amber, Daniel's mistress. The woman who'd sat in the courtroom watching Evelyn's humiliation. The woman who'd left Daniel the moment his money disappeared. What does she want? She says she has information you might find useful about Mr. Moore. Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to know about Daniel. She didn't want him in her life in any capacity, not even through secondhand information from his former girlfriend. But curiosity got the better of her. Send her in, but Sarah, stay close. If this gets uncomfortable, I want her escorted out immediately. Understood. Amber Chen looked different than she had in the courtroom. Less polished. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced with jeans and a simple sweater. Her nails were plain, no more expensive acrylics. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her face was bare of the heavy makeup she'd worn when she was Daniel's trophy girlfriend. She looked, Evelyn realized, almost normal. Thank you for seeing me, Amber said, hovering nervously in the doorway. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, Evelyn admitted. What do you want, Amber? I wanted to apologize. The words came out in a rush. For everything. For being with Daniel while you were still married. For sitting in that courtroom watching him humiliate you. For not speaking up when I should have. For all of it. Evelyn studied her, trying to determine if the apology was genuine or just another angle. Why now? It's been 3 months. Because I saw your speech in Paris. I read the articles about what he did to you. And I realized, Amber's voice cracked slightly. I realized he was doing the same thing to me, making me dependent on him, isolating me from my friends, convincing me I was only valuable because of him. I was just too stupid to see it until everything fell apart. She pulled out her phone and showed Evelyn a photograph. It showed Daniel and Amber at a restaurant, and Daniel's hand was visible on Amber's wrist, gripping hard enough to leave marks. He took this photo himself, thought it was romantic. I didn't realize until later that you can see the bruises. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. He hurt you. Not often, just when I did something that embarrassed him or questioned him too much. Just enough to keep me scared. Amber put the phone away. After you left him and everything collapsed, he got worse, angrier, more violent. I left before it got really bad, but I know other women weren't as lucky. Other women? Amber nodded. After I left, he moved to Florida, started using dating apps, looking for women who had money he could use. I still have friends in those circles, and they've been warning each other about him. He's dangerous, Ms. Vale, and I thought you should know. Evelyn considered this information, weighing what it meant. Daniel was out there, broken and angry and looking for new victims. Part of her wanted to track him down, to make sure he faced consequences for every terrible thing he'd done. But another part, the wiser part, knew that Daniel Moore was no longer her problem. "Thank you for telling me," Evelyn said finally. "I'll make sure this information gets to the right people. The authorities in Florida should be aware." "There's one more thing," Amber said. "I know it doesn't change anything, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I was wrong about you. In the courtroom, watching you ask for nothing, I thought you were weak. I thought Daniel was right to leave you, but you weren't weak. You were playing a game he didn't even know existed, and you won." She held out her hand. "I'm going back to school, getting my degree finished, trying to build a life that doesn't depend on rich men. Your story inspired me to try." Evelyn looked at Amber's outstretched hand for a long moment, then shook it. "Good luck, Amber. I hope you find what you're looking for." After Amber left, Evelyn sat in her office for a while, processing the conversation. Daniel was still out there, still dangerous, still looking for people to hurt. But he was also broken and desperate and running out of places to hide. Eventually, the law would catch up to him. Eventually, his past would collapse on him completely. But that wasn't Evelyn's responsibility anymore. She'd spent 6 years being responsible for Daniel's emotions, his success, his happiness. She'd made herself small to make room for his ego. She'd hidden her brilliance to let his mediocrity shine. Never again. 6 months after the divorce, Evelyn Vale received an invitation to testify before a congressional committee about intellectual property theft and the need for stronger protections for innovators. She accepted, spent 2 weeks preparing with Caroline's team, and delivered testimony that was praised by legislators on both sides of the aisle. 9 months after the divorce, she was offered a tenured position at MIT, teaching computer science and advising graduate students. She accepted that too, excited by the prospect of mentoring the next generation of innovators and making sure they understood the importance of protecting their work. A year after the divorce, Evelyn stood in her Seattle apartment, a beautiful space in Capitol Hill with high ceilings and large windows and enough room to actually breathe, and realized she was happy. Genuinely, completely happy, in a way she hadn't been since before she met Daniel. The Attribution Project was thriving, helping dozens of people reclaim credit for stolen work. Her MIT position was challenging and rewarding. She had friends, real friends who knew her story and valued her for who she was. She had freedom, independence, a life that was entirely her own. And Daniel Moore had become exactly what he'd accused her of being: forgotten, irrelevant, erased from the narrative of his own company. The SEC investigation had concluded with criminal charges. Daniel had been convicted of securities fraud and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He'd be eligible for parole in 18 months, but even after release, his reputation was permanently destroyed. No tech company would touch him. No investor would trust him. The name Daniel Moore was synonymous with fraud, abuse, and spectacular failure. Meanwhile, Evelyn Vale had become synonymous with innovation, resilience, and the kind of dramatic comeback that inspired think pieces and business school case studies. She'd won, completely, absolutely, in every way that mattered. On the anniversary of her divorce, Evelyn hosted a small dinner party in her apartment. Marcus came, of course, and James, who'd become more friend than bodyguard over the months. Caroline was there, and Sarah, and Patricia Williams from the Moore Technologies Board, who'd become a mentor and friend. A few MIT colleagues, a couple of friends from the Attribution Project, people who made Evelyn's life richer just by being in it. They toasted her success, her survival, her future. They told stories and laughed and celebrated not just what Evelyn had overcome, but what she'd built in its place. As the evening wound down and guests started to leave, Marcus pulled Evelyn aside on her apartment's small balcony. The Seattle skyline spread out before them, and for once the sky was clear, stars visible between the city lights. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Not for destroying Daniel, though that was satisfying, but for rebuilding yourself. For turning your pain into something that helps other people. For being stronger than the person who tried to break you." "I had help," Evelyn said. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You could have," Marcus corrected. "It might have taken longer, been harder, but you would have found your way eventually. You're a survivor, Evelyn. That's not something I taught you. That's something you've always been." After everyone had left and the apartment was quiet, Evelyn stood at the window and looked out at the city that had been the setting for both her worst moments and her greatest triumphs. Somewhere in this city, in a building she now partially owned, More Technologies was thriving under new leadership. Her name was on the patents. Her work was recognized. The company she'd built was finally, officially hers. Somewhere far from here, Daniel Moore was learning that actions had consequences, that stolen credit eventually came due, that you couldn't build an empire on someone else's genius and expect it to last. But Evelyn wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about tomorrow and the lecture she'd be giving at MIT about encryption algorithms. She was thinking about the new cases the Attribution Project was taking on, helping more people reclaim their stolen work. She was thinking about the life she'd built from the ashes of her marriage, a life that was messy and challenging and entirely, completely hers. The woman Daniel Moore had tried to erase no longer existed. In her place stood Evelyn Vale, innovator, survivor, founder, professor, and living proof that you could lose everything and still win. She didn't need his apology, or his acknowledgement, or his regret. She didn't need anything from him at all, because she'd already taken back everything that mattered: her name, her work, her future, and most importantly, herself. And that was the sweetest victory of all.